The ship drifted in the cold darkness between stars. It moved slowly, pulled by the weak gravity of distant suns, spinning in a lazy circle that took 3 hours to complete. Burn marks covered its hull. Great holes had been torn through its metal skin. Frozen atmosphere leaked from cracks in its armor like blood from old wounds. Senior Examiner Han watched the ship grow larger on his viewing screen. His 4 eyes blinked in sequence as he studied the vessel. In his 200 years of service to the conquered of ascending species, he had examined the technology of 31 different civilizations. He had seen wonders that would make younger species weep with joy. He had seen horrors that still visited him in his sleep. But he had never seen anything quite like this. "The ship appears to be of unknown origin," said Navigator Oss from his station. "Our databases contain no match for its design profile." Han leaned forward in his command chair. The chair adjusted to his movements, sensing the tension in his body. "How old is the wreck?" "Thermal analysis suggests the vessel has been drifting for approximately 40 standard cycles. The damage patterns indicate combat, heavy combat." "A battle," Han said quietly. "This ship lost a battle." "It would appear so, Senior Examiner." Han pressed a button on his chair. "All examination teams prepare for boarding. I want full analysis protocols. Metallurgy, weapons, propulsion, biological samples if available. This is a priority investigation." The conquered of ascending species had watched over the galaxy for 12,000 years. They were not the oldest civilization, but they were the most organized. They had taken it upon themselves to monitor the younger races, to study their development, to ensure that no species rose too quickly and threatened the peace of the cosmos. It was important work, necessary work. And part of that work involved studying the technology of other species. Living civilizations were protected by strict non-interference laws. The conquered could watch, but they could not touch. They could observe, but they could not interact. These rules had kept the peace for. But a dead ship floating in empty space, that was different, that was salvage, that was science. Han's shuttle crossed the gap between his research vessel and the drifting wreck. As they drew closer, the true size of the damaged ship became clear. It was enormous, far larger than any vessel the conquered used for similar purposes. Its design was brutal and functional, with none of the elegant curves that more advanced species preferred. This was a ship built for one purpose, and that purpose was war. The shuttle found an opening in the hull where an explosion had torn away several meters of armor plating. They passed through into darkness. "Lights," Han ordered. Beams of white light cut through the black interior of the ship. Han saw corridors stretching away in multiple directions. The walls were thick and heavy, designed to withstand tremendous force. Emergency lighting flickered weakly along the floor, suggesting that some power system still functioned. The examination team moved carefully through the damaged vessel. Their environmental suits protected them from the vacuum and cold. Their instruments scanned everything they passed, building a picture of the ship's construction and purpose. "Senior Examiner," called Technician L from ahead, "I have found markings, writing of some kind." Han moved to join her. On the wall, partially obscured by blast damage, he saw letters in an unfamiliar script. He activated his translation matrix and held it up to the writing. The device hummed as it worked, comparing the symbols against its vast database of known languages. After several minutes, it produced a result. "UES Thermopylae," Han read aloud. "United Earth Navy." The words meant nothing to him. He transmitted the information back to the main research vessel, requesting a database search. The response came quickly. "Earth is the of a species called humans. They are relatively new to space travel. First confirmed interstellar flight approximately 500 standard years ago. Classification, premature technological. Threat assessment, minimal." Han frowned. 500 years of was nothing. Species at that stage of development were usually still struggling with basic propulsion systems. They built small ships for short journeys. They explored their immediate neighborhood with caution and fear. They did not build vessels like this. "Are we certain of this information?" he asked. Confirmed, Senior Examiner. Human civilization has been under observation for the past 300 years. They occupy a small region of space in the outer spiral arm. They are considered unremarkable. Unremarkable. Han looked around at the massive corridors, the thick walls, the heavy construction. Nothing about this ship was unremarkable. Everything about it spoke of a species that had learned hard lessons about war and survival. "Continue the examination," he ordered. "I want to know everything about this vessel." The teams spread out through the ship. They documented everything they found. The corridors were wide enough for troops to move quickly. The doors were reinforced against explosive breach. The internal structure was divided into sealed sections that could be isolated if one area was damaged. This was not a ship designed for exploration or trade. This was a ship designed to fight, to be hurt, to keep fighting after being hurt. Han found himself standing in what appeared to be a command center. Screens lined the walls, all dark now. Chairs were bolted to the floor, designed to hold their occupants in place during violent maneuvers. A large chair sat in the center of the room, facing the main viewing screen. The captain's chair. He walked over to it and stood looking down at the seat. A human had sat here. A human had commanded this vessel. A human had made decisions that led to battle and death. What kind of species built such things? The conquered had thousands of civilizations over the most followed predictable patterns. They developed technology slowly and carefully. They avoided conflict when possible. They sought trade and cooperation with other species. War was something they engaged in reluctantly when all other options had failed. But this ship told a different story. This ship spoke of a species that had embraced war, that had studied it and perfected it, that had poured vast resources into creating the most effective instruments of destruction possible. Han felt a cold sensation in his chest that he had not experienced in many years. Fear. He pushed the feeling aside and activated his communicator. "All teams, report to the main research vessel in 4 hours. I want preliminary analysis ready for review by the end of the cycle." As he walked back toward the shuttle, Han passed through corridors filled with the evidence of violence. Scorch marks on walls, holes punched through metal, the frozen remains of atmosphere that had once sustained living beings. The humans had lost this battle. Their ship was a wreck. Their crew was dead. But Han could not shake the feeling that the story was not so simple. The damage patterns bothered him. The position of the ship bothered him. Something about the situation did not match his expectations. What had the Thermopylae been doing out here, so far from human space? What had it been fighting? And most importantly, what had the battle truly cost? These questions would need answers, and Han suspected that he would not like what he discovered. Chief Metallurgist had spent her entire career studying the materials used by different civilizations. She understood metals and alloys the way poets understood words. She could look at a piece of armor and tell you not just what it was made of, but what the species that made it feared. The samples from the human ship frightened her. She stood in her laboratory aboard the research vessel, surrounded by instruments that represented the most advanced analytical technology in the known galaxy. She had already run 4 complete analyses on the hull fragments recovered from the Thermopylae. Each time, she had assumed her equipment was malfunctioning. Each time, the results had come back the same. "This is impossible," she whispered to herself. The armor plating from the human ship was composed of 7 distinct layers. Each layer served a different purpose. Each layer used different materials, and several of those materials should not be able to exist together in a single structure. The outermost layer was designed to ablate. When struck by a weapon, it would vaporize, carrying enormous amounts of heat away from the ship. It was a sacrificial shield, meant to be destroyed so that the layers beneath could survive. The second layer was a crystalline matrix that distributed kinetic force. A projectile hitting this layer would have its impact spread across a wide area, reducing the chance of penetration. I had seen similar technology in conquered warships, but the human version was denser and more efficient. The third and fourth layers were alternating bands of hard and soft metal, hard to stop projectiles, soft to absorb energy. The pattern repeated dozens of times in the space of a few centimeters. But it was the innermost layers that disturbed her most. She had found radiation shielding of a type she had never encountered before. Dense and heavy, it surrounded every critical system and every crew compartment on the ship. She ran calculations on its effectiveness and found that it could block radiation levels that would kill most species instantly. "They have hardened their vessel against nuclear weapons," she said aloud. Her assistant, L, looked up from his own workstation. "Many species use nuclear deterrents. This seems reasonable." A shook her head. "You do not understand. This is not a precaution. This is not a backup system in case something goes wrong. This shielding is built into the fundamental structure of the ship. It is not optional. It is baseline." She pulled up her analysis on the main screen so L could see. The humans did not build this ship hoping it would never face nuclear attack. They built it assuming that nuclear attack was certain. They expected it. They planned for it. L's skin paled to a lighter shade of blue. "What kind of wars do they fight?" "The kind where nuclear weapons are not the final option. The kind where nuclear weapons are just another tool." A continued her examination. She found reactive armor that would explode outward when struck, disrupting incoming projectiles. She found self-sealing compounds that would fill breaches automatically. She found structural reinforcement that would allow the ship to continue fighting even with massive damage to its hull. Every element of the armor told the same story. The humans built their ships to be hurt. They expected damage. They expected penetration. They expected entire sections to be destroyed. And they kept building anyway. The philosophy behind this design was alien to everything I understood about warfare. The conquered built ships to avoid damage. Their shields were meant to stop attacks before they could reach the hull. Their armor was a last resort, used only when shields had failed. But the humans had built their armor as a primary system. Their ship was designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. It was designed to survive wounds that would kill any conquered vessel outright. "They do not fight like us," I said quietly. "They do not even think like us." She examined the weld patterns and construction techniques. The work was precise but not elegant. Function had been prioritized over form at every stage. There were no decorative elements, no wasted space, no unnecessary complexity. Everything served a purpose, and that purpose was survival in combat. The thickness of the armor varied across the ship. Critical areas were protected by layers that measured nearly a meter deep. Less important sections had thinner protection. The humans had made calculated decisions about what could be sacrificed and what must be preserved. I found evidence of repair work throughout the samples. The Thermopylae had been damaged before its final battle. Patches covered old wounds. New armor had been welded over damaged sections. The ship had fought and been hurt and had been repaired and sent back to fight again. How many battles had this vessel survived before its last one? She wrote her preliminary report and sent it to Senior Examiner Han. Then she sat in her laboratory, surrounded by samples of human armor, and tried to understand what she had learned. The conquered of ascending species had maintained galactic peace for 12,000 years. Their fleet was the most powerful force in known space. Their technology was centuries ahead of any potential rival. They had never faced a serious threat to their dominance. But looking at these armor samples, a felt uncertainty for the first time in her career. The humans were 500 years into. They should be building fragile exploration vessels with minimal protection. They should be afraid of the dangers of space. They should be cautious and careful and slow. Instead, they had built a ship that could survive nuclear attack. They had built armor that expected to be penetrated. They had created a philosophy of warfare that assumed damage and planned for survival. What would they build in another 500 years? What would they build in 1,000? I looked at the human armor and saw the future. It was a future where the conquered's comfortable supremacy might not last forever. A future where this young and violent species might challenge the established order of the galaxy. She hoped she was wrong, but the samples in her laboratory suggested otherwise. The humans had built their ship to take punishment that would destroy any other vessel. They had built it to keep fighting when all hope seemed lost. They had built it to survive. And somewhere in the cold darkness between stars, that ship had died anyway. What, I wondered, had been powerful enough to kill it? And what had the Thermopylae done to its enemies before the end? She did not want to think about the answers, but she knew that the other examination teams were finding their own evidence. The weapons analysts, the propulsion specialists, they were all discovering pieces of the same puzzle. And when those pieces came together, I suspected that the picture they formed would change everything the conquered believed about the universe. The humans were not unremarkable. The humans were terrifying. Weapons analyst L had served the conquered of ascending species for 200 years. In that time, he had studied the armaments of 47 different spacefaring civilizations. He had examined plasma weapons and kinetic accelerators and energy beams of every description. He had written scholarly papers on the evolution of warfare among intelligent species. He considered himself an expert in violence. He had always believed that he could not be shocked. He was wrong. The weapons systems aboard the human ship, Thermopylae, had broken something inside him. He sat in his office aboard the research vessel, staring at his analysis screens, trying to find words for what he had discovered. He had started with the secondary weapons. These were the smaller guns that lined the sides of the human vessel in neat rows. From a distance, they had seemed unremarkable. Standard kinetic accelerators, perhaps, projectile weapons of the type used by many spacefaring species. Then he had examined them closely. The human weapons used electromagnetic acceleration to launch projectiles at speeds approaching 8% of the speed of light. The projectiles themselves were simple tungsten rods, dense and heavy and hard. At their launch velocity, each rod carried kinetic energy equivalent to a tactical nuclear weapon. And the humans had mounted dozens of these weapons along each side of their ship. L had calculated the potential damage output. A single broadside from the Thermopylae could deliver more destructive force than the entire weapons complement of a standard conquered cruiser. The humans had built a ship capable of filling space with nuclear-level destruction using nothing but metal rods accelerated to impossible speeds. But the secondary weapons were not what had broken L. The primary weapons were worse. He had found the main gun batteries near the front of the ship. They were massive things, taking up entire sections of the vessel. He had spent 3 days trying to understand how they functioned. When he finally succeeded, he had needed to sit down and breathe carefully for several minutes. The humans had weaponized plasma. They had developed a way to contain stellar fire using magnetic fields. They could shape it, focus it, and launch it at targets with devastating accuracy. The temperatures involved were almost beyond measurement. The plasma would melt through any armor in the known galaxy as if it were water passing through cloth. The humans had looked at the hearts of stars and decided to build weapons from them. L had studied many species. He had seen clever weapons and brutal weapons and efficient weapons, but he had never seen anything that spoke of such absolute commitment to destruction. The plasma cannons were not defensive systems. They were not deterrents. They were instruments of annihilation, built by a species that had decided that some enemies deserved to burn. And then there were the missiles. L had found the missile bays deep in the belly of the ship, row after row of autonomous weapons platforms, each carrying its own targeting systems and propulsion units. They were designed to be launched in swarms, to overwhelm enemy defenses through sheer numbers. The warheads used antimatter. L had stared at that result for a long time. Antimatter was the most destructive force available to any civilization. When matter and antimatter met, they converted entirely to energy. The reaction was absolute and total. Nothing survived. Most species treated antimatter with extreme caution. The conquered used it only in the most desperate circumstances. The risks of containment failure were too great. The moral weight of such weapons was too heavy. But the humans had built antimatter warheads in quantity. They had mass-produced Apocalypse and stored it in the bellies of their ships. L ran calculations on the potential yield of a full missile salvo from the Thermopylae. The numbers made no sense to him at first. He ran them again and again. A full salvo could destroy a small moon. He sat back in his chair and tried to understand the minds that had created such things. What kind of species looked at the universe and decided that this level of destructive power was necessary? What enemies did they face that required weapons capable of cracking worlds? Or was this simply what humans considered normal? That thought disturbed him most of all. The conquered had spent building the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. They had done so reluctantly, in response to specific threats, with careful consideration of the moral implications. Every weapon they deployed was justified and documented and regulated. But the humans seemed to have no such hesitation. They had built weapons of mass destruction as casually as other species built trading vessels. They had filled their ship with death and destruction and sent it out into the galaxy. L examined the tactical systems next. The targeting computers were advanced and sophisticated. They could track hundreds of targets simultaneously. They could predict enemy movements and adjust firing solutions in real time. They could operate autonomously if the crew was incapacitated. The humans had built their weapons to keep killing even if everyone aboard was dead. He found evidence of damage from the Thermopylae's final battle. Several weapon systems had been destroyed. Others had been damaged and repaired during the fight. The crew had worked to keep their guns firing even as the ship died around them. They had kept fighting until the end. L wrote his report with hands that would not stop shaking. He described each weapon system in technical detail. He provided calculations and analysis and expert opinion. He tried to be professional and objective. But in his conclusion, he abandoned professional language entirely. The humans have built a ship that is not merely armed, he wrote. They have built a ship that exists for the sole purpose of destroying other ships. Every system, every design choice, every allocation of resources points toward a single goal: the ability to inflict maximum damage on any enemy, regardless of the cost. This is not a warship as we understand the term. This is a temple of destruction crewed by devoted. The humans have not simply developed weapons. They have elevated warfare to an art form and practiced it with religious dedication. I have studied violence for 2 centuries. I believed I understood it. I understood nothing. The humans have harnessed stellar fire. They have tamed antimatter. They have built kinetic weapons that strike with nuclear force. And they have done all of this in 500 years of. If they continue on this path, I cannot predict what they will build next. I am not certain I want to know. He sent the report to Senior Examiner Han and then sat alone in his office for a long time. Outside his window, the damaged bulk of the Thermopylae drifted in darkness. A dead ship full of terrible weapons, a monument to human violence. And somewhere far away, The humans were building more ships just like it. Al had studied 47 species in his career. None of them had frightened him. Until now. You had never liked examining dead bodies. It was a necessary part of her work, but she had always found it disturbing. The dead deserved respect. They deserved to rest in peace. Cutting them open and analyzing their tissues felt like a violation of something sacred. But she had a duty to perform, and she would not let her discomfort stop her. The bodies from the human ship Thermopylae had been preserved by the vacuum of space. Cold and airless, they had not decayed. They remained almost exactly as they had been at the moment of death. This made his work easier from a scientific perspective. It made it harder from every other perspective. She had found 17 bodies so far. Most had died from explosive decompression when the hull was breached. Others had been killed by weapons, fire, or debris. A few had died at their posts, still strapped into their chairs, hands reaching for controls that no longer functioned. They had died fighting. You began her biological analysis with the standard protocols. Height, weight, physical structure. The humans were bilateral bipeds, similar in basic form to many species in the galaxy. They had 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head with forward-facing eyes. Their skeletal structure was internal, made of calcium compounds. Their muscles attached to bones through flexible tendons. Nothing remarkable so far. Then she looked deeper. The human cardiovascular system was powerful and efficient. Their hearts pumped blood through every part of their bodies, carrying oxygen and nutrients to hungry cells. Their lungs were large and capable of processing atmosphere with high efficiency. But it was the human endurance that first caught her attention. She examined muscle samples and found evidence of extraordinary stamina. The human body was designed for sustained activity over long periods. Their ancient ancestors, according to the ship's cultural database, had been persistent predators. They had hunted by following prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. The humans had evolved to never stop. You studied the human nervous system next. She found reaction times that were faster than most species. She found sensory organs that could process information quickly and accurately. She found a brain that was capable of complex thought and rapid decision-making. And she found the adrenal glands. These small organs sat atop the human kidneys, producing a chemical called adrenaline. When a human faced danger, these glands released their contents into the bloodstream. The effects were immediate and dramatic. Heart rate increased, blood flow to muscles improved, pain sensitivity decreased, strength and speed enhanced, cognitive function sharpened. The humans had a built-in combat mode. You read through the medical files stored in the ship's database. She learned that humans could continue fighting despite injuries that would incapacitate most species. They could function without sleep for extended periods. They could push their bodies beyond normal limits through sheer force of will. The medical files also described something called shock. When severely injured, the human body would shut down non-essential functions to preserve life. A human could lose massive amounts of blood and still remain conscious. They could suffer terrible wounds and still keep fighting. They were hard to kill. But the biological data was only part of the story. You needed to understand the human mind as well. She found psychological profiles in the crew files. She found training manuals and tactical doctrine. She found cultural references and historical records. What she learned disturbed her more than any biological data could. The humans had a concept called acceptable losses. This was a calculated willingness to sacrifice their own lives for strategic advantage. Human commanders made decisions knowing that some of their soldiers would die. Human soldiers followed orders knowing that those orders might kill them. They accepted death as the price of victory. You found records of something called boarding actions. When human ships engaged enemy vessels, they sometimes sent soldiers across in small craft. These soldiers would breach the enemy hull and fight hand-to-hand in corridors and compartments. They invaded enemy ships and killed the crews in close combat. The training manuals described techniques for fighting in confined spaces. They described weapons designed for ship-to-ship combat. They described tactics for clearing rooms and securing objectives. The humans had turned violence into a science. But what disturbed you most was the cultural attitude toward death and sacrifice. She found historical records of battles where human soldiers had fought to the last. They called these last stands. A small force would hold a position against overwhelming odds, fighting until they were all dead. The humans did not see this as tragedy. They saw it as glory. The soldiers who died in last stands were remembered as heroes. Songs were written about them. Monuments were built in their honor. Children learned their names in school. The humans celebrated those who chose death over surrender. You sat in her laboratory, surrounded by dead bodies and disturbing data, and tried to make sense of what she had learned. Most species avoided death. They surrendered when victory was impossible. They retreated when the odds turned against them. They valued survival above all else. But the humans were different. The humans had evolved from predators who never stopped chasing their prey. They had built a civilization that honored those who died fighting. They had developed a psychology that embraced sacrifice and rejected surrender. They were not merely capable of violence. They had elevated it to virtue. You wrote her report with a growing sense of unease. She described the human body in clinical terms. She explained their biological advantages and psychological traits. She documented their cultural attitudes toward war and death. In her conclusion, she was blunt. "The humans are not like other species," she wrote. "They are predators who have never lost their hunting instincts. They are warriors who see death in battle as the highest honor. They are soldiers who will keep fighting long after any reasonable species would have surrendered. They build weapons of terrible destruction. They armor their ships to survive nuclear attack. They train their crews to fight until the last breath. And they do all of this not because they must, but because they choose to. The humans are not afraid of death. They are afraid of cowardice. They are afraid of surrender. They are afraid of being seen as weak. They would rather die than lose. I do not know how to fight a species like this. I do not know how to negotiate with them. I do not know how to predict their behavior. I only know that I am grateful they are far away. And I hope they stay there." She attached her biological data and sent the report to Senior Examiner Han. Then she looked at the bodies of the human crew and felt something she had not expected to feel. Respect. These strange, violent, terrifying creatures had died at their posts. They had fought until the end. They had refused to surrender even when all hope was lost. They were monsters, but they were brave monsters. And somewhere in the galaxy, millions more just like them were building ships and training for war. You shivered and returned to her work. Senior Examiner Han sat alone in his office, surrounded by reports from every member of his team. The data filled dozens of screens. Analysis and speculation and fear poured from every document. He had read them all. He had read them several times. And now he understood. The human ship Thermopylae had not been fleeing when it was destroyed. The damage patterns made that clear. The wounds were concentrated on the front of the vessel, not the rear. The engines had been running at full power toward the enemy, not away. The Thermopylae had been attacking. Han's technical team had managed to recover partial logs from the ship's computer. The data was fragmented and incomplete, but it told a story. A terrible, magnificent, horrifying story. 17 vessels had attacked a human colony world. The attackers were identified in the logs as hegemony raiders. Han did not recognize the name. Perhaps they were a species the conquered had not yet. Perhaps they were already extinct. The human response had been immediate. The Thermopylae had been stationed at a nearby system. When the distress call came, it had not waited for reinforcement. It had not called for backup. It had not made a tactical assessment of its chances. It had simply gone. One ship against 17. Han read the log entries with growing amazement. The Thermopylae had entered the battle at full speed, guns already firing. The plasma cannons had destroyed the first enemy ship before the raiders even realized they were under attack. The kinetic accelerators had filled space with deadly tungsten rods. The missile bays had emptied their contents into the enemy formation. The raiders had turned to fight. They had outnumbered the human ship by 17-1. They had surrounded it and pounded it with everything they had. The Thermopylae had kept fighting. The logs showed system failures cascading through the ship, hull breaches on multiple decks, weapon systems going offline, crew members dying at their stations. But the ship never stopped. The humans never stopped. 11 enemy ships had been destroyed before the Thermopylae finally lost main power. 11 ships against 1. Han found the final log entry buried in the damaged data core. It had been recorded by the ship's captain, a human female whose name was given as Commander Sarah. The recording was audio only, captured in the last minutes of the ship's life. The quality was poor. Static interrupted the words, but Han could understand enough. Thermopylae to command. 11 confirmed kills. Hull breach on all decks. Drives failing. We will not reach the colony in time, but we have bought them hours. Crew has voted unanimously. We are going to try to take one more with us. There was a pause, the sound of alarms in the background, the hiss of escaping atmosphere. It has been an honor. Tell our families we did not hesitate. The recording ended. Han sat in silence for a long time. The Thermopylae had been dying. Its crew had known they could not survive. They had known they could not save the colony they were trying to protect. And they had voted to ram the largest enemy ship. They had voted to sacrifice themselves for a chance to kill one more enemy. They had not hesitated. Han thought about the reports from his team, the impossible armor, the apocalyptic weapons, the biological advantages, the cultural worship of sacrifice and death. He thought about what kind of species would build such things, what kind of species would use them so willingly, what kind of species would die rather than retreat. And he thought about the future. The humans had been spacefaring for 500 years. In that time, they had developed technology that rivaled species with advancement. They had built ships capable of fighting vastly superior numbers. They had created a military culture that produced soldiers willing to die for strategic advantage. What would they accomplish in another 500 years? What would they build in 1,000? Han wrote his report to the conquered High Council. He included all the technical data and biological analysis. He included the recovered logs and the story of the Thermopylae's last battle. And he included his recommendations. The species known as humans must be immediately reclassified, he wrote. Current threat assessment of minimal is dangerously inaccurate. Recommend new classification of existential concern. All observation activities within human-claimed space should cease immediately. We must not risk any action that humans might interpret as hostile. We must not give them any reason to notice us. The conquered has maintained galactic peace for 12,000 years through superior force. If humans continue their current rate of development, that superiority will end within 2 centuries, perhaps sooner. But that is not what frightens me most. What frightens me most is that the Thermopylae was not a flagship. It was not unique. It was not the pride of their fleet. Human records indicate it was a standard cruiser, one of hundreds. The humans have not built one ship capable of fighting 17 enemies and killing 11. They have built hundreds of such ships, perhaps thousands. We have spent believing we understood violence. We believed we knew the limits of what a species would do to win. We believed we had seen the worst the galaxy could produce. We were wrong. The humans have shown us what true warfare looks like. It looks like armor designed to survive nuclear attack. It looks like weapons that harness the fire of stars. It looks like soldiers who vote to die rather than retreat. It looks like a single ship charging 17 enemies because a colony needed help. The conquered must change its approach to this species. We cannot threaten them. We cannot challenge them. We cannot give them any reason to turn their terrible weapons toward us. We must hope that they remain far away. We must hope that their violence remains directed at others. We must hope that they never see us as enemies. Because if they do, I do not know if we can stop them. The humans are coming. They expand their territory every year. They build more ships every day. They train more soldiers every hour. And they have no intention of being conquered. They have no intention of surrendering. They have no intention of ever stopping. The humans are the future. I do not know if there is a place for us in that future. But I know that I am afraid. For the first time in my long career, I am truly afraid. Hans sent his report, and then looked out his window at the drifting wreck of the Thermopylae. A dead ship crewed by dead humans, a monument to violence and sacrifice and unstoppable determination. Somewhere far away, Commander Sarah's family would never know exactly how she died. They would only know that she had not hesitated. Han hoped they found comfort in that. He hoped someone found comfort somewhere. Because looking at the evidence of human capability, he could find no comfort at all. The humans were coming, and the galaxy would never be the same.